You can hear it if you listen closely enough, even across 30,000 years. It's a rhythmic, tiny sound, a scrape, a click, a soft pull of friction. Imagine you are sitting in the tall, golden grass of a Central European July. The sun is huge and low, refusing to set, hanging in a sky so blue it looks like a bruise. Beside you, a woman is working. She isn't hunting a mammoth or fighting a cave lion. She is just sitting. In her hand is a tiny sliver of bone, no longer than your pinky finger, polished until it shines like glass. She's using a sharp flint flake to bore a microscopic hole through one end of that bone. This is a needle. It is perhaps the most mundane, quiet object you could imagine. But as she pulls a thread of dried reindeer sinew through that eye, she is doing the one thing that will allow our species to conquer the planet. We have this image of the Ice Age as a perpetual, screaming blizzard. A world of white, where humans huddled in dark caves, shivering and waiting for a death that was always just one sunset away. We see the winter because the winter is dramatic. But the winter was only half the story. The real secret of our survival, the reason you are breathing today, happened during the 6 to 12 weeks when the ice retreated. The Ice Age summer wasn't a vacation. It was a high-stakes, frantic, sensory-overloaded race against a clock that never stopped ticking. It was a season of sweat, blood, and the smell of rendering fat. And it all started with the realization that the world you think you know, the frozen wasteland, was actually a sea of grass. We often imagine the Paleolithic world as a barren tundra. But researchers like Dr. Dale Guthrie have spent decades proving that this is a fundamental misunderstanding. During the last glacial maximum, the landscape wasn't dead. It was a productive, hypercharged ecosystem known as the Mammoth Steppe. You might think the extreme cold would have killed everything off. It didn't. Because the air was so cold, it was also incredibly dry. There wasn't enough moisture for deep snow to pile up, which meant the grass was always accessible. In the summer, this world exploded. Imagine a grassland that stretched from the Atlantic coast of France all the way across the Bering Land Bridge and into the Yukon. It was the largest biome on Earth. When the summer sun hit this steppe, it stayed up for 20 hours a day. The grass didn't just grow, it surged. It was a carpet of high-protein herbs and flowers shimmering in the wind. The air would have smelled of sage, crushed stems, and the musk of a million heavy bodies. It was the African Serengeti, shifted thousands of miles north and turned cold. You would have seen herds of reindeer so thick they looked like a moving forest of antlers. You would have seen woolly rhinos grazing in the distance like gray boulders. And everywhere, there was the sound of the wind in the grass. This was the stage. This was the bounty. But don't let the beauty fool you. But the abundance of the grass was a cruel illusion. You see, on the Mammoth Steppe, the plants didn't just provide food. They provided a deadline. The moment the first green shoots appeared, every human group in the Northern Hemisphere began to move. They didn't move randomly. They followed the rivers. If you were standing on a ridge in what is now the Czech Republic 25,000 years ago, the summer would have brought a specific scent on the wind, the smell of wood smoke and old hides. This was the season of the Great Gathering. For 10 months of the year, humans lived in tiny, isolated family bands of perhaps 15 or 20 people. They were ghosts on the landscape, spread so thin they might not see another human face for a season. But the summer changed the math. The surplus of food, the migrating herds, and the blossoming plants meant that for a few short weeks, the land could support hundreds of people in a single spot. This was the Internet of the Stone Age. This was where the isolated bands collided. You would have walked into a camp and heard a dozen different dialects. You would have smelled exotic things, scents carried from hundreds of miles away. Archaeologists have found Mediterranean seashells in Ice Age camps in central Germany. They found Baltic amber in the valley of the Danube. These items didn't walk there. They were traded, hand to hand, person to person, in the heat of the summer sun. It was a time of marriages, of settling old grudges, and of sharing the most precious resource of all: information. A hunter from the east might tell you about a new way to flake flint. A grandmother from the south might show you a root that heals a fever. But as the social fires burned, a darker reality was looming. You might think that with all this trade and celebration, the summer was a time of leisure. It was the opposite. It was the most exhausting labor our ancestors ever endured. Because while the summer brought the herds, it also brought the fat gap. This is a biological trap that most people today have never heard of, but it was the primary cause of death for Ice Age humans. It's called protein poisoning, or rabbit starvation. If you eat nothing but lean meat, the muscle of a reindeer or a horse, you will starve to death with a full stomach. Your liver cannot process that much protein without fat to balance it. In the winter, the animals were lean and starving, their fat stores depleted. If you hunted them then, you were eating empty calories that would eventually kill you. The summer was the only time the animals were fat. This meant the summer was not just a hunt for meat, it was a desperate harvest of lipids. Imagine the scene at a summer kill site. The air is thick with flies and the heavy, metallic scent of blood. The men have brought down a bison, but they aren't just taking the steaks. They are obsessed with the parts we usually throw away. They are cracking the long bones with heavy stones to get at the yellow, buttery marrow. They are stripping the fat from behind the eyes and around the kidneys. This was the gold of the Ice Age. During the summer months, the camp would have been a factory. Women and children would spend 16 hours a day rendering this fat down. They would take large skins, fill them with water and bits of fat and bone, and then drop fire-heated stones into the mixture until it boiled. The grease would rise to the top, where it could be skimmed off and stored in bladders. This was their fuel. This was their insurance policy. They were building a fat bank that would have to last them through 9 months of darkness. If they missed the window, if they didn't harvest enough lipids during the short summer, the winter wouldn't just be cold. It would be a slow metabolic execution. But even with the bladders of fat filled to the brim, the problem of the cold remained. You might think they just toughed it out. They didn't. They out-engineered the cold. And the summer was when the construction began. We think of cavemen living in caves, but in much of the Mammoth Steppe, there were no caves. There were only open plains. So our ancestors built their own mountains. In places like Mezhedich in modern-day Ukraine, archaeologists have found the remains of some of the most extraordinary dwellings in human history: mammoth bone huts. These weren't piles of trash, they were architectural masterpieces. A single hut could be made from the bones of 95 different mammoths. Imagine the sensory experience of building one of these in the summer heat. The bones would be heavy, bleached white by the sun. You would use the massive lower jaws of the mammoths to create a circular foundation, interlocking them like a puzzle. The tusks would be used to create an arched doorway, soaring over your head. The roof would be draped in heavy mammoth hides, sewn together with that bone needle we saw earlier. These houses were permanent, they were warm, and they were a statement. They said, "We are not just passing through this world, we own it." But building a house of bone takes time. It takes a summer of hauling, lifting, and engineering. And it wasn't the only technology they were perfecting under the sun. You could be forgiven for thinking that these humans were just survival machines, focused only on calories and shelter. But the science tells us they were something much more complex. They were artists, and the summer was their gallery. In the Czech Republic, at a site called Dolní Věstonice, researchers led by Dr. Olga Sofer have discovered something that shattered our understanding of the Ice Age. Among the bones and the charcoal, they found tiny fragments of fired clay. These are the oldest ceramics in human history, dating back 25,000 years, long before the invention of pottery. But they weren't making bowls, They were making art. They were shaping figures of women and animals, then intentionally putting them into the heart of a high-temperature kiln until they exploded. It was a ritual, a summer performance. But Sofer found something even more shocking. When she looked at the clay fragments under a microscope, she saw the impressions of woven fibers. These people weren't just wearing furs. In the summer, they were harvesting wild flax and nettle. They were spinning thread. They were weaving baskets, nets, and even cloth. The Ice Age wasn't just a world of leather. It was a world of textiles. Imagine this summer camp filled with the sound of weaving, the sight of brightly dyed fibers hanging in the sun. They were creating a visual world that was as rich and textured as our own. And they were doing it all while the clock was counting down. But the most haunting evidence of what they did in the summer doesn't come from their tools or their huts. It comes from their graves. You might think a prehistoric burial would be a simple affair, a hole in the ground for a life cut short. But at a site called Sungir in Russia, we found the remains of 2 children and an older man buried 30,000 years ago. They were covered in ivory beads. Not just a few, but 13,000 of them. Each bead was meticulously carved from mammoth tusks. Experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate these beads. A single bead takes about an hour to make. That means the beads in that one grave represent 13,000 hours of human labor. That is the work of years. This work was done in the summer, when the light was long and the hands were warm enough to hold the tiny drills. It tells us that these people weren't just surviving. They were grieving. They were loving. They were pouring their most precious resource, time, into honoring their dead. They were creating a legacy that they knew would outlast the ice. But the reality of the science often contradicts our romantic visions of the past. To truly understand the Ice Age summer, we have to look at the forensics. Let's dive into the specifics of a study conducted on the skeletal remains from the Gravettian culture, which flourished during the height of the cold. When we look at the bones of these summer hunters, we don't see the marks of a peaceful life. We see the marks of rodeo riders. The frequency of healed fractures in the upper bodies of Ice Age hunters is almost identical to the injury patterns of professional rodeo athletes today. This tells us exactly what the summer hunt looked like. It wasn't a long-distance game of archery. They didn't have powerful bows yet. They had spears. To kill a bison or a horse, they had to get close. They had to be within arm's reach of a ton of panicked, muscular animal. The summer was a season of broken ribs, shattered collarbones, and concussions. But here is the wow fact that changes everything. The bones show that these people survived their injuries. They had fractures that had healed perfectly over months. This is the ultimate proof of human compassion. If you break your leg on the mammoth steppe, you are dead, unless someone carries you, unless someone brings you water, unless someone shares that precious summer fat with you while you sit by the fire. The Ice Age summer was the forge where human cooperation was hammered into its final shape. We didn't survive because we were the strongest predators. We survived because we were the best at taking care of our broken. As the summer progressed, the activity in the camps reached a fever pitch. There was a specific transition that happened in the final weeks of August. You would see it in the way they handled the fish. In many parts of Europe and Siberia, the late summer brought the salmon runs. This was a gift from the rivers. The water would literally turn red with fish. But you can't eat 10,000 salmon in a week. This is where the time machine of the Ice Age comes in. The humans would build drying racks that stretched for hundreds of yards along the riverbanks. The smell would have been overpowering, the salty, oily scent of drying fish mingling with the wood smoke. They were locking the summer calories into a dry, portable form. They were turning the abundance of a moment into the survival of a year. This is the cognitive leap that separates us from almost every other creature. A squirrel hides nuts by instinct. A human dries fish because they can see the January blizzard in their mind while they are standing in the August heat. They were living in two times at once. And then there was the clothing. You might think that any old fur would keep you warm. It won't. If you wear a simple hide draped over your shoulders in a negative 40-degree wind, the heat will escape from the gaps and you will die of hypothermia in hours. To survive the Ice Age, you needed tailored clothing. You needed trousers that fit your legs, parkas that sealed at the wrists and neck, and boots that were waterproof. All of this was summer work. The hides had to be cured while the sun was out. They had to be scraped until they were as soft as velvet. And then came the sewing. Remember that bone needle? That needle was the high technology of the era. By sewing multiple layers of different furs, perhaps a soft rabbit fur on the inside for insulation, and a tough, oily reindeer hide on the outside for windproofing, they created the first spacesuits. They created a microclimate that they carried with them. A human in a well-sewn parka could stand on the open step in a gale and feel as warm as if they were sitting by a fire. This was the true conquest of the ice. It wasn't done with fire. It was done with a needle and thread in the long, golden light of July. But as the days began to shorten, a new kind of tension entered the camp. The relatability bridge here is simple. It's the feeling of a Sunday evening before a long work week, multiplied by 1,000. You can see it in the archaeological record, the way the tools change. As the summer waned, the hunters stopped making general-purpose tools and started making specialized ones. They were preparing for the migration. They knew exactly which valley the reindeer would pass through. They knew which river ford would trap the horses. This was the final harvest. The mass kill sites, like those found at Solutre in France, show the remains of thousands of animals. This wasn't a sport, it was a harvest. They would drive the herds into natural cul-de-sacs or over cliffs, harvesting meat on a scale that is hard to imagine. The sound would have been deafening, the thunder of hooves, the shouts of the hunters, the whistling of spears. And then the silence. The weeks of butchering, the mountain of meat that had to be processed before it spoiled. This was the climax of the summer. This was the moment when the fat bladders were topped off, when the drying racks were full, and when the bone huts were finally sealed. However, it is a mistake to think that this was a world of constant, grim labor. One of the most beautiful discoveries of recent years comes from a site in Germany called the Hohlefels Cave. There, researchers found a flute made from the wing bone of a griffon vulture. It has carefully carved finger holes. It is 35,000 years old. Imagine a summer night in an Ice Age camp. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a sky of deep violet. The fires are low, smelling of bone fat and cedar. And then someone begins to play. The sound is thin and high, a lonely melody that drifts out over the sea of grass. It would have been the only artificial sound in the entire world. No engines, no electronics, no city hum. Just the flute and the wind. It reminds us that these people had a soul. They had a need for beauty that was just as strong as their need for fat. They weren't just surviving, they were flourishing. They were the masters of their world, not its victims. The Ice Age summer was a cycle of extreme sensory inputs. The blinding light of the 20-hour sun, the smell of sage and blood, the feel of soft fur and hard bone, the taste of marrow and wild berries. It was a time when the human spirit was pushed to its absolute limit, not by the cold, but by the opportunity. It was the season where we learned how to be a community, how to trade, how to sow, and how to plan for a future we couldn't see. We are the children of the summer race. Every person alive today is the descendant of someone who successfully ran that 6-week gauntlet. Your ancestors were the ones who worked the hardest, who sewed the best seams, who found the most fat, and who remembered the most stories. They didn't just survive the Ice Age, they used it to become the most formidable creature the planet has ever seen. Think about that bone needle one more time. It represents the tiny, mundane choices that lead to greatness. It represents the willingness to sit in the sun and do the small, boring work that makes the big, dramatic survival possible. We often look for the secrets of history in wars and kings, but the real secret of our species is a woman sitting in the grass, boring a hole through a splinter of bone so her child won't freeze in 5 months' time. That is the definition of humanity. It is the ability to love someone who doesn't exist yet, the future self and the future child, and to work for them with everything you have. As we look back at those summers, we have to realize that the world they lived in is gone. The mammoth steppe has vanished, replaced by forests and farms. The mammoths are long dead. The great herds have dwindled. But the software they developed during those frantic weeks, the social brain, the planning mind, the compassionate heart, that is still running in you. You are an Ice Age survivor living in a warm world. And perhaps that's why we still feel a strange ancestral pull when the days get long and the grass grows high. We are remembering the race. We are remembering the work. We are remembering the time when the sun never set and the only thing standing between us and the dark was each other. But don't get too comfortable in the warmth. The Ice Age wasn't a single event, it was a heartbeat. For the last 2.5 million years, the Earth has pulsed between ice and sun. We are currently living in a brief, warm interglacial period, a summer that has lasted 10,000 years. We've used this long summer to build cities, to invent the internet, and to fly to the moon. We've forgotten what it's like to live on the clock. We've forgotten the smell of the rendering fat and the urgency of the bone needle. But the geology is clear. The ice always comes back. It is the default state of our planet. And when the long summer finally ends and the sea of grass returns to cover our ruins, I wonder if we will remember how to run the race. I wonder if we will still know how to sit in the grass and do the small, quiet work that survival requires. If this journey into our deep past has shifted your perspective, I invite you to join us for more of these explorations. We are dedicated to uncovering the forgotten rhythms of the human story, the moments that made us who we are today. Subscribe and stay with us as we dig deeper into the mysteries of our ancestors, because their story is your story. And it is a story that is still being written. What is the one thing from your modern life that you think would surprise an Ice Age ancestor the most? Is it our abundance, our loneliness, or our lack of preparation? Let me know in the comments. I read every one, and I love seeing the connections you make between our world and theirs. We often think of ourselves as the masters of nature, the ones who have finally escaped the cycles of the earth. But we are only here because of a 6-week window of grass and grease. We are the beneficiaries of a frantic ancient hustle. We are the survivors of the long sun. And as you go about your day, in your climate-controlled car or your heated house, just remember that quiet, scraping sound of the bone needle. It is the sound of your own life being sewn together, stitch by stitch, across 30,000 years of ice. The sun is setting on our long summer, and the wind is starting to pick up. The ice didn't break them. It just paused to watch what we would do with the warmth.